Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, because it's that time of year again, and all of the children are coming back, and by children we mean MPs. I figured we'd have a chat with one of our good friends, Paul Wells, about where things are going and what we're seeing on the landscape. Paul, I guess one of the things I guess we'd start with is, do we think that Carney has transmitted a level, a sufficient level of alarm for where we are in the world right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think all the evidence I have is that this government is working full time on the sort of things you would hope it was working full time on,
Right.
trying to salvage the best possible version of a trading relationship with the United States, trying at the same time to substantially build out trading relationships with Europe and Asia, and perhaps a little less diligently working on this one Canadian market or one Canadian economy.
Of which there are only so many federal levers that he's got at his disposal.
Well, exactly, and although I think very generally, one underexploited lever is the power of the pulpit.
Right.
This is a government that doesn't say much except when Mark Carney says it. I think because ministers and staffers are unsure what to say, and he's quick to rebuke them if they don't say the right thing.
Yeah.
But the obligation and the opportunity to simply explain what you're doing in multiple forums repeatedly is one that this government has been slow to exploit. I was at the cabinet retreat outside Toronto last week, and it was kind of sweet. They on the days when Carney wasn't talking, they put out some cabinet ministers to take reporters' questions, and they were fairly generous about the time that they devoted to that. But they had no positive message that they wanted to push out, and they hadn't really prepared. The contrast with just about every other party, government, political organization in modern politics was kind of stark. They were like,
Yeah.
I don't know, what do you want to play? I don't know, what do you want to play? And that really hasn't been a big problem for this government yet. But if I was them, I would work on that.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely different in that, there wasn't a whole list of pre-selected messages that they had on a time to release schedule like the previous government did. But at the same time, you wind up saying not a whole lot at all in the absence of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So I'm sometimes impressed by Melanie Joly as a public figure, as a leading figure in this government, and sometimes less impressed. She gave a hell of a scrum on Thursday,
Yeah.
and kind of put together a few different elements of what she, as industry minister, is trying to get accomplished, and the challenges that she faces, principally being that Canada is not a very attractive destination for outside investment as long as the neighbor is yelling crazy stuff 24/7.
Yeah.
And it was all very interesting, but it was a little bit random. It was a little bit in response to whatever the question from the journalist was. And I mean, I'm in the odd position of having spent now years decrying message politics, and now I'm a little nervous because the government doesn't have any message that it wants to put out. But
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah. It's a very strange kind of almost weird no man's land we're kind of living in around that.
yeah, I mean, it's new government syndrome. They're overwhelmed. I mean, just about everyone is overwhelmed, and they've got harder work than most people do. But I hope they are continuing to work on building out capacity in a bunch of different ways, including communications capacity, because the opposition leader is happy to speak for this government, and they might not like the way he phrases things.
Yeah, and that seems to me almost like a lesson that nobody seems to have learned is that if you don't have a message that can counter Poilievre's, then he's willing to just, kind of take that message and run with it while the government's just kind of like flailing in behind. And, Trudeau's government was famous for that, responding to everything under the sun with, a bunch of pablum that was all, well-meaning and feel good, but didn't really respond and didn't counter anything, and this one is just not saying anything.
Yeah,
So
I mean, they would say that their actions, speak louder than words ever could, and there's something to that. I mean, that was a fairly substantial suite of sort of income maintenance and disaster prevention measures that the Prime Minister rolled out on Friday, and anyone can read that for themselves. But I think we're in an unusual time, and that people get nervous, and that part of any government's mandate is to address those concerns by explaining itself.
yeah, for sure. And I guess one of the things that I'm kind of noticing is like Carney will say something really big, like the era of global free trade is at an end, but it's almost like there's nothing that kind of like he says it, but there's almost no follow up on it. If you kind of get my meaning, and I have to wonder about that right in this particular moment, because I'm still seeing things like the business lobbies still urging him to bend the knee. I'm still seeing this kind of framing everything as though we just have to hold out till we can get a deal, even though there's no deal to be had that's worth the paper it's written on, kind of thing. And so I guess I wonder how much of that is sinking in where it should be.
I mean, we'll kind of know when it's over. I asked one kind of mid-ranking figure in the government about some decision that was made and announced, and asking for some background on it, and they said, "You're going to have to wait for my memoir." I mean, that's always true, and but I like so. Part of the novelty of this moment is that everyone's got to do everything all at once.
Yeah.
You actually, I mean, even in the kind of unlikely situation where the Prime Minister got up and said the President of the United States is a lousy so-and-so and to hell with him,
Yeah.
we still have to trade, something more than $1 billion worth of goods a day with the United States.
Yeah.
And so it's probably wise to try and make sure that trade goes as smoothly as possible. I was nervous from the beginning about this notion that Canada can turn its page on the United States and look elsewhere. Unfortunately, you have to look elsewhere while not turning a page on the United States. Carney knows more than I do about Brexit, and the story of Brexit is you simply can't ignore the 500 million people next door who are more like you than anyone else.
Yeah.
And to the extent that Britain has tried to do that, it's had a bad few years of it. And so you have to try and my new term for it is dealing with Trump is you have to try to flatter the weather. Like it's just
Yeah.
going to rain or not, but you have to, you have to do your weather dance and hope for the best, while you're also talking to everybody in the world who wishes they could ignore the United States. And when I hear that the clerk of the Privy Council, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, and his Canada-US Minister are all in Washington simultaneously, I do worry about the number of eggs we're putting in that basket. But I sympathize.
Yeah.
I mean, it's make or break time for the continental relationship, And I think the time will come when we're further down the road to judge exactly how well they did all of this. But it's I like I in the early years of any new government, and I have finally decided this is actually a pretty new government, even though a lot of the characters have not changed. I tend to be indecisive, and like I tend not to be a hanging judge.
Yeah.
I get everything they're trying to do, and I have some sympathy for all of the possible critiques of it. And I'll tell you later which side was right.
For sure. Um, I guess the last thing I would say about Carney is the amount of pushback I get on the notion that he is playing some kind of 3D chess, or that he's just biding time for some secret plan, which is not obvious to me. I just wonder, from your particular vantage point, like how you're seeing these reactions as compared to, the kinds of criticisms that his predecessor would face.
So, in a polarized environment where we just fought an election and where the other side nearly won, it makes sense that conservatives in general, and the conservative leader in particular, would just never stop, would not pause for a second in saying, this guy's a pure fool who's ruining everything, right?
Yeah.
And given that, like that's rational, and as a bonus, I think Pierre Poilievre probably believes it. But given that he's doing that, it's understandable that people who want a Liberal government to do well would say, no, it's exactly the opposite of that. Rather than being a pure fool who's going to wreck everything, he's actually a strategic genius who's smarter than all of us put together. And I see some of that online. I see some of that kind of,
Yeah.
it's like, oh, Carney, he just gets Trump, he gets everything. One day we'll carve his face into mountainsides. I suspect the truth is somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
That he means well, and that he is clever, and that does have good people working with him, but that maybe not everything is purely cast genius. You know? And so there's room for, I tend to look at sort of my strategic objectives as a journalist last, but I do think there's room in journalism for a skeptic who says, the stakes are high and the times are dire, and I hope everything works out for the best, but let's kick the tires on some of these decisions. You know? And if he's smarter than me and turns out to have been right all along, then that will be an excellent problem for me to have as a skeptic. Because it'll be, and we'll see,
Yeah. All right. I guess our next topic would be going down the list here would be Poilievre, and in the early summer, everyone's, oh, he's been humbled, oh, he's changed. Nothing I've seen, particularly in the last few weeks, has indicated anything of the sort. Are you, I guess it's not what so much are you looking forward to, but like, is there something in particular you are looking to see from him that we might not have seen previously?
I guess the first thing to say is I'm not much vexed by his continuing insistence on blaming everything on the Liberals. I mean, that is, there's a lot of precedent for that. When Stéphane Dion was leader of the Liberal Party against Prime Minister Stephen Harper, he blamed every sparrow that fell on Stephen Harper. It's opposition work. But he ran into trouble in the spring when a bunch of people said, okay, now am I ready to make him my prime minister? And what was missing in the spring, perhaps, was a willingness to build a team, including from people he didn't necessarily agree with all the time, or who didn't necessarily flatter him all the time. Mm-hmm. There's a French term that translates as making arrows from any wood. And there, you haven't seen a lot of indication that Pierre Poilievre is willing to make arrows from any wood.
Right.
And And then a preparedness for some of the basic elements of the job. He is constantly blaming other people for not handling Trump correctly, or not handling the provinces correctly, or this, And
Yeah.
I've seen no indication that Pierre Poilievre ever intends in his life to ever sit down and have a meeting for the purposes of having the meeting and the conversation, rather than for the purposes of the press release and the TikTok video he can make afterwards.
Yeah.
And that's weak. That is a constant, repeated expression of moral weakness on his part that's got to stop, and I would say that to his face.
All right. Yeah.
Like, apparently he's having trouble organizing a meeting with Doug Ford. That's great. There's 20 million other Canadians who didn't vote for him, who he still would have to govern if he became the prime minister. Can he talk to any of them the way you and I understand a conversation?
Yeah.
And until he can, he will be seen by a lot of potential conservative voters as not really being serious.
Yeah. All right. Next down on the list, I guess, would be the NDP, and they are about to go into a leadership contest.
Yeah.
So far, the only sitting MP who seems to have declared is Heather McPherson.
Yeah.
Are we expecting much out of this, or do we think this is going to turn into kind of I guess just a very internal thing within the party where they make a serious effort at soul searching, or is this going to be like we're going to make a big splash and try and just make as much noise as possible?
I think there is a lot of room for a party like the NDP in our politics, and arguably increasing room if Mark Carney is going to the
the second coming of the progressive conservatives.
Yeah. And Heather McPherson is an interesting and likable MP. She would tend to make the NDP into more of a constant expression of despair and outrage over the fate of Palestinians in Gaza that I think is useful. But she comes by those sentiments honestly, and they're widely shared.
Yeah.
It'd be surprising if that sentiment wasn't expressed in our politics somewhere. The NDP, and then there's Avi Lewis, who seems like he's tempted to run, and Avi's politics, which once seemed way outside the NDP mainstream, are now solidly where I think most New Democrats are. I think there was a moment when he would have looked like a star candidate in the 1990s, and that moment is long behind him. He honestly has to begin by explaining to most Canadians who he ever was. And
True enough. Yeah.
That's unfortunate, but it's the case, and then eternally, the NDP has to decide: is it the voice of a certain urban intellectual set, or is it the voice of working Canadians who, in a lot of cases, don't at all share the same preoccupations?
For sure.
And under Jack Layton, it was pretty successful at being both. Like, it's possible you can be a Big Ten, but that's on the list of questions that should be asked of any NDP candidate.
Yeah, well, especially considering the collapse of their blue collar vote during that last election.
Yeah, it's Brian Topp on his Facebook page. I'm not connected to Brian Topp on Facebook, but somebody shared it. And Brian's a long-standing union leader and strategist, and was very close to Jack Layton. He draws an extended distinction between allies and cool kids. And the allies are the ones who actually want to show up and organize and go door to door, and the cool kids are the ones who post snark on social media and so on. Yeah. And I think I without endorsing it down the line, I think a lot of what Brian says is a distinction that New Democrats have to think about. Because most New Democrats, like most people who are still New Democrats today, I mean, I hate to break it to them, but they're basically cool kids, and there
Yeah.
aren't enough cool kids, to win you 40 seats in Canada. You need some actual Canadians.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's it's going to be an interesting way to try and bring that coalition back together, given the, I guess, kind of disparity of where those two poles have kind of moved apart. But
Yeah,
but
it's
yeah,
it's um, like it's always easier. It's easy for us to talk, right? It's easy for us to say, well, you're too far to the left or you're too far to the right or whatever. Like
yeah,
it's harder to impose yourself, but there's a reason why Pierre Poilievre was able not only to drive the NDP vote down, but to recuperate a good chunk of the NDP vote to the Conservatives, because Pierre Poilievre sounded reasonably persuasive when he worried about whether people can afford to make ends meet and whether they can get a good paying job
yeah,
and an endless succession of New Democrats told me that Jagmeet Singh's suits and watches were not a problem, and that he simply, liked to dress well. And I mean, I would like to dress well too, but in the
yeah.
end, people were not like too many New Democrat voters were not able to look past that, or they were not able to look towards anything that resonated with them. And
Yeah,
so they went
well,
shopping for it. They went shopping for it in Poilievre's Conservative Party.
yeah, I think there was still a hangover from the kind of notion amongst a bunch of new Democrats that Singh could somehow out Trudeau, and that people would flock to him for those reasons, and it never happened. But it's hard to pivot when that is basically your selling feature.
Yeah,
Um,
it's.
yeah,
I mean, if you're a New Democrat, you've got to think that the Liberals and the Conservatives look more like each other than they ever have, and surely there's room for New Democrats.
yeah,
It's there's no obligation on the voter the way to see it the way you see it. The obligation is on you to describe it in a way that resonates with the voter.
yeah.
And I know there's no end of New Democrats who are putting their heart and soul into this struggle and really mean it. And they have not had great recent success, so best of luck to them.
No, for sure. And I guess the other thing I worry about the NDP is just they spent so much time trying to make everything federal jurisdiction that it almost kind of set them up for failure in a certain way as well. But
Yeah,
that's one of my own particular bugaboos.
yeah. I mean, and given that the successful New Democratic parties in this country have been provincial parties, the like Jagmeet Singh often seemed to be hoping for a simpler Canada rather than to find advantage in the Canada he was in. I mean,
Yeah.
when he became a leader, Alberta had an NDP premier, and it's there have been relatively strong performances by New Democrats in Manitoba and Saskatchewan as well as in British Columbia, and like there's not the open animosity that there is between Doug Ford and Pierre Poilievre,
Yeah.
but it it you never saw Singh succeeding, or I think even trying to use those parties as a trampoline.
Yeah, or at certain points, some of those provincial leaders would try and actually create distance, whether that was Rachel Notley or Naheed Nenshi now, or um, yeah. So
It's but if politics was easy, then there'd be more
everyone would
people
do
who
it
attempt to try.
for sure. All right. I guess last question would be: is there anything in particular you are anticipating in the fall that I guess you kind of got your eye on?
There's a half dozen ministers, Gregor Robertson at Housing, Chrystia Freeland at Internal Trade, and several more. Stephen Guilbeault is Minister of Canadian Identity, who kept a lowish profile through the summer, which is understandable. Planning is a perfectly reasonable prelude to action. But I'll be curious to see what kind of personality they bring to their jobs and what kind of success they have. And I think the eternal question in the early, in the first year of whatever the Carney era is it a one-man show?
Yeah.
And so I'm looking for more evidence that something can happen in Moncton while the Prime Minister's in Halifax, and we'll see.
Yeah. I guess if I would have to say something, it would just be when we get this major projects list and what winds up being on it, because there's a lot of hopes being pinned on fantasy projects for whom there are no proponents, and no economic case, but we are somehow building a case that Canada's going to fail if these fantasy projects don't happen, and so it's going to be very interesting to see what they do wind up coming with.
Yeah, and then the eternal Canadian temptation to bean count. Does my province have projects in relation to my conception of my province's importance? And if any list gets picked apart on those grounds, then we're in big trouble as a country.
Yeah,
because picking a list apart is much easier than producing a list.
for sure. All right. Well, thanks so much for doing this, and we'll talk again in the not too distant future.
Thanks for having me on.
All right.
Cheers.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for our 300th episode. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.